What would you do if you watched a hero, a real one, not the kind made in Hollywood, get treated like he was invisible? It was the summer of 1962, inside the cool, humming air of a first-class airport lounge at Los Angeles International Airport, and the room was full of people who had somewhere important to be. Men in suits checked their watches. Stewardesses walked briskly past with their clipboards and painted smiles. And there, standing near the entrance of that lounge, was a young Marine in his dress blues, ribbons on his chest, shoes polished to a mirror shine, being told, quietly but firmly, that there was no seat available for him. Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. And then, from the far end of that lounge, a large man in a tan jacket slowly set down his drink and stood up. His name was Corporal James Randall Tatum, and he was 23 years old. He had come from a small town in eastern Tennessee called Irwin, a place of railroad tracks and mountain mornings, where men still tipped their hats and women still hung laundry on the line. James had grown up the way most boys of that era grew up in Appalachian America, with very little money, very deep pride, and an unshakable sense that when your country called, you answered. His father, Robert Earl Tatum, had served in the Pacific during the Second World War. His uncle had died at Chossin Reservoir during Korea. Service was not a career for the Tatums, it was a covenant. James had enlisted in the Marine Corps in the spring of 1958 at 17, signing his papers with his mother weeping quietly at the kitchen table, and his father standing behind her with his jaw set and his eyes wet. He had served 3 tours, including a classified advisory rotation through Southeast Asia in the early days of what the government was calling a limited engagement in Vietnam, though the men on the ground knew better. He had seen friends carried off jungle floors on stretchers. He had written letters home that he never sent, because some things could not be put into words without breaking something in the person who read them. By the summer of 1962, James Tatum was heading home on leave for the first time in 14 months. His mother had written to say his father was not well, the kind of not well that meant he needed to get there soon. He had taken a military flight from Da Nang to Manila, then a commercial connection to Hawaii, and now he was at Los Angeles International, 90 minutes from a connecting flight that would take him to Knoxville, and ultimately to the man who had shaped everything he was. He had approached the first-class lounge not out of arrogance, but because a fellow officer, a Navy lieutenant he had befriended on the flight from Hawaii, had told him his service ribbons entitled him to access the lounge through a military courtesy program that several airlines had quietly begun offering. The lieutenant had walked in ahead of him, been waved through without a second glance. But when James Tatum approached the desk, the attendant, a man in his mid-30s with slicked hair and an expression of practiced indifference, had looked at him, looked at his ribbons, and informed him that the lounge was at capacity. There were, in plain sight, at least a dozen empty chairs. James Tatum did not argue. He had not been raised to make scene. He simply nodded, stepped back, and stood near the entrance with his duffel bag at his feet and his cover tucked under his arm, his face a careful mask of dignity over something that was clearly breaking inside him. That is the image that burned itself into the room that day. A young Marine, fresh from a war nobody was calling a war yet, standing alone at the threshold, denied a seat in a country he had bled for, and doing it without flinching. The injustice was not loud, it was quiet, and somehow that made it worse. At the far end of the lounge, near a wide window overlooking the tarmac, a man sat alone with a glass of bourbon and a newspaper folded in his lap. He was large not in a soft way, but in the way of a man who had once been an athlete and still carried that frame even as the years had rounded certain edges. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, with a broad, weathered face and pale blue eyes that moved slowly and missed very little. He wore a simple tan jacket over an open collar shirt and a hat that shaded his expression just enough to make it difficult to read. He was not a flashy man, not in this moment. He was, to most people in that lounge, simply a well-built older gentleman reading his paper and minding his business. But he had not been reading for several minutes. He had noticed the Marine the moment he appeared at the entrance. He had watched the exchange at the desk with the kind of stillness that comes not from disinterest, but from the discipline of a man who processes things deeply before he acts. His jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly when the attendant turned the young man. His eyes had moved slowly across the room, counting the empty chairs, the occupied ones, the people who were looking down at their magazines a little too deliberately. He had set his newspaper on the side table beside his drink. He had rested his large hands on his knees. For a moment he sat there, very still. It is worth understanding something about this man before going any further. He had spent his entire adult life playing heroes, men of principle, men who stood when others sat, men who spoke when others went quiet. Some people said that the distance between the man and his roles was vast. Others, those who had known him in private moments, in the years before the fame had calcified into mythology, said that the distance was smaller than the world imagined, that the values he portrayed, loyalty, decency, the refusal to walk past a wrong, were not performances so much as expressions of something that had been in him since he was a boy growing up in Winterset, Iowa, and later Glendale, California, the son of a pharmacist who had taught him that a man's word and his actions were the only currencies that mattered when everything else was stripped away. He was thinking, in that moment, about something his father had told him once. He was thinking about what it meant to wear a uniform in a country that asked men to do things it would later pretend not to remember. And then he stood up. He crossed the lounge slowly, and people noticed him immediately, because of course they did. By 1962, John Wayne was perhaps the most recognizable face in the United States of America. He had just come off the production of The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, and his face had been on theatre marquees and magazine covers for over 2 decades. Heads turned. Someone near the window whispered something to the woman beside her. A businessman near the bar did a quiet double take, but John Wayne was not looking at any of them. He walked directly to the desk where the attendant still stood, sorting papers with the absorbed indifference of a man who believed the previous interaction had concluded. Wayne stopped in front of him, and he waited until the man looked up. When he did, his face went through several rapid expressions: recognition, surprise, the beginning of a smile before Wayne spoke. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform. He spoke in the same low, measured tone he used when he was not acting, which was somehow more commanding than anything he had ever delivered on screen. He told the attendant that he wanted to give up his seat. He said it simply and plainly, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. He said that the corporal standing behind him had earned every right to sit down in this room, and that he himself was perfectly comfortable standing. Then he turned, walked back to where James Tatum was still standing near the end, and introduced himself not as a movie star, not as a celebrity, but by his given name. Marion Morrison, he said, extending his hand. James Tatum, to his immense credit, did not react the way most 23-year-olds would have reacted. He shook the hand. He said his own name. And then John Wayne picked up the young Marine's duffel bag, carried it himself to the seat he had just vacated near the window overlooking the tarmac, set it down, and gestured for the corporal to sit. The lounge had gone very quiet. Not the polite quiet of people pretending not to stare. The genuine quiet of people who have just witnessed something they were not expecting to feel anything about, and found, to their surprise, that they felt a great deal. The attendant at the desk had not moved. Several people who had been looking away now were not looking away. A woman near the centre of the room had pressed her hand against her mouth. John Wayne returned to the desk, ordered a second bourbon, and carried it back to where the corporal was now sitting. He sat down in an adjacent chair, a lesser one, with no view, and said nothing for a moment. He simply sat there, a large man in a tan jacket next to a young man in dress blues, both of them looking out at the planes on the tarmac. What happened in the next 40 minutes became something that those present in that lounge carried with them for the rest of their lives. Several of them later recounted the scene to family members, to journalists, to anyone who would listen in the years that followed with a consistency of detail that is rare and revealing. They all remembered the same things. The quiet. The way John Wayne leaned back in that chair as if he had all the time in the world. The way the young Marine slowly, visibly, let something go, some held tension in his shoulders, some carefully maintained composure, and became, briefly, just a tired 23-year-old boy who needed a place to sit. They talked for a long time, the two of them. Nobody heard most of what was said, but several witnesses recalled seeing Wayne lean forward at one point, forearms on his knees, listening with a focused intensity that most people in Hollywood would have recognized as the look he wore when something genuinely mattered to him. James Tatum spoke. Wayne nodded slowly. At one point, the young Marine looked out at the window for a long moment, and Wayne let a woman named Dorothy Caldwell, a retired schoolteacher from Pasadena who had been waiting for a flight to Phoenix that afternoon, later told her daughter that she had never in her life seen a famous person do something that felt so unfamous. She said that what struck her was not the gesture itself, grand as it was, but the way John Wayne stayed. He did not make his point and leave. He did not perform the act and return to his paper. He sat with that boy for the better part of an hour, and he was fully, completely present in a way that she said you don't often see in anyone, famous or otherwise. At some point, a flight announcement came over the intercom. Wayne stood. He shook Tatum's hand again, a long handshake. Both hands, the kind that means something more than... He retrieved his hat from the side table, picked up his bag. He paused for just a moment, looked at the young corporal one last time, and then walked toward his gate. The room watched him go, and when he had disappeared through the door, a ripple of quiet exhale moved through the lounge, the sound of a room that had been holding its breath and only just realized it. James Tatum made his flight to Knoxville. He arrived home in time. The story did not surface publicly for many years. John Wayne never spoke about it. That was consistent with everything those who knew him well said about the man, that the things he was most proud of were the things he never mentioned. His publicist at the time had not been present. There was no photographer, no press release, no strategic timing. It was simply a thing that happened in an airport lounge on a summer afternoon, witnessed by strangers who had no particular reason to be paying attention and found themselves unable to look away. What made the moment carry the weight it did was not the fame of the man involved. Strip John Wayne out of the story entirely, and you are left with this: a person who noticed an injustice, felt the specific kind of rage that quiet injustice produces in a person of conscience, and then did the specific, costly, personal thing required to correct it. He gave up his seat. He carried the bag. He stayed. Those are not the actions of a man performing generosity. Those are the actions of a man who understood in his bones. That dignity is not divisible, that you cannot claim to honour something in the abstract while tolerating its violation in front of you. The private moment between them, in those 40 minutes by the window, remains largely unknown. But James Tatum, in an interview given decades later to a small veterans publication in eastern Tennessee, recalled one thing that was said. At some point during their conversation, when Tatum had explained where he was going and why his father, the illness, the 14 months away, Wayne had looked at him and said, quietly, "Get there. Everything else can wait." It was not a movie line. It was not a performance. It was one man telling another man the most important thing he knew, at the exact moment it needed to be said. James Tatum did get there. His father, Robert Earl Tatum, passed away 11 days after James arrived home. They had nearly 2 weeks together, 2 weeks that James later said contained more real conversation than the previous 5 years combined. He credited part of that time to a stranger in a tan jacket who made sure he had a seat and who somehow, with 7 quiet, reminded him what the flight was actually for. John Wayne died in June of 1979 of stomach cancer at his home in Newport Beach, California. He was 72 years old. The tributes that followed were enormous, from presidents, from actors, from generals, from ordinary people who wrote letters by the tens of thousands. Most of them spoke about the roles he had. Very few of them knew about the afternoon at Lax in 1962, the Marine in dress blues, the empty chairs, and the man who stood up when no one else did. But that may be exactly the point. The truest things about a person rarely make the headlines. They live instead in the memories of the people who were there, and in the quiet, lasting consequences of what it means to be seen and told that you matter on an ordinary Tuesday in a world that had nearly walked past you without stopping. There is a version of heroism that gets celebrated in this country, the loud kind, the decorated kind, the kind that comes with cameras and ceremonies and standing ovations, and that kind of heroism is real, and it deserves every honour it receives. But there is another kind, quieter and perhaps more difficult, that asks something different of a person. It asks them to pay attention, to look up from their newspaper, to notice the young man standing at the threshold and understand, without being told, what that moment costs him, and then to do something about it, not because anyone is watching, not because it will be remembered, but because it is simply, plainly, the right thing to do. John Wayne was many things complicated, imperfect, larger than life, in ways that were not always comfortable. But on that afternoon in Los Angeles, in the summer of 1962, he was just a man who stood up. And sometimes that is the whole of it. Sometimes standing up is the entire story. If this moved you, if it reminded you of someone you know, someone who served, someone who was treated as invisible when they deserved to be seen, share this video with them. Leave their name in the comments, because the least we can do is say the names of the people who never asked for recognition, and make sure that somewhere, somehow, they are heard. After all, who in your life has quietly stood up for someone else and never once asked for credit? Remember, the quietest acts of decency are often the ones that echo the longest.